Hi students. In this video we're going to continue our discussion of punishment and more specifically a discussion of how retributivism sort of gets played out, or some of the implications that the truth of retributivism would have for our approach to punishment. So in this paper by Sanford, Kadish, Criminal Law and the Luck of the Draw, Kadish looks at the sort of role that luck plays in how the criminal justice system approaches crime and people who do the wrong thing. Let's take a look at his thesis. So what's Kadish trying to argue? What's he trying to convince us of? So at first I'm just going to say this sort of vague thing, but then we're going to explain what that means. So in this paper, Kadish argues that the harm doctrine is not rationally defensible. So you might be saying, well, what's the harm doctrine? What does that mean? So the harm doctrine, which is not to be confused with the harm principle, right? The harm principle was something that Mill thought was true, and he said basically you can't prohibit people from doing something unless it causes harm to others. So you can't prevent people from harming themselves. But this is something different. The harm doctrine says that the punishment for wrongdoing should be reduced, it should be lower, if the harm caused by the wrongdoing doesn't occur, even if the wrongdoing itself is intentional. Or to sort of put it the other way, right? Punishment for wrongdoing should be increased if the harm does occur. So a simple case of this, right, is like, say you want to kill someone, right, and you're going to try and shoot them. If you succeed and you kill them, you should be punished more than if you fail. That would be one example of how the harm doctrine might play out. So let's look at a case kind of like that. I'm going to call it snipers. So say there are two snipers, two assassins. They're planning to murder the president of the NRA, Carolyn Meadows. Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone go do this. Just sort of picked maybe an ironic person to kill with a gun, which would be the president of the NRA. So now, the first person, let's say, who attempts to shoot Carolyn, shoots from atop sort of a distant high-rise during a public speaking event. Again, just sort of the kind of case we might see in a late-night television show. When this person shoots, we get a gust of wind that blows his bullet off course, and Meadows survives. So let's say she's not even harmed. Now let's imagine another event, right? Later, she's at another speaking engagement, and the second sniper tries the same thing. This time, however, there's no gust of wind, and Meadows is killed. Both snipers, let's say, are caught by the police, and they're put on trial. The question we want to ask ourselves, the question that I think is philosophically interesting here, right? Should the snipers be punished equally, or should the second sniper who killed Meadows be punished more severely than the first? What do you think? Right? We know what would happen, right? In our actual justice system, right? Assuming keep the facts fixed. There's no controversy about whether or not what happened here. In this case, the second sniper would be punished more severely than the first, because the second sniper actually did more harm. Right? The first one didn't accomplish their goal, and maybe there's caused some harm, right? Presumably, shooting at someone in the middle of a public event is going to cause harm. People are going to be scared, things like that. So it's not that they didn't cause any harm, but they caused less harm. They didn't accomplish sort of the goal of the action that they were trying to do. So what this example that I've just given is an example of what Sanford Kadish calls the law of attempts. So what the law of attempts says is that attempts should be punished more severely when they're successful. So we can, if this is true, if the law of attempts is true, then that gets us a certain kind of argument that justifies our actual practice. Right? So the law of attempts says attempts should be punished more severely when they're successful. Premise 2 says the first sniper's attempt to kill Meadows was unsuccessful. Premise 3, the second sniper's attempt to kill Meadows was successful. And so when we got these sort of two cases, the first sniper's attempt wasn't successful, the second sniper's was. And if we know that attempts should be punished more severely when they're successful, we get the conclusion that the second sniper should be punished more severely than the first. Now what Kadish is going to sort of circle back around to is that premise 1, attempts should be punished more severely when they're successful. The question is really going to be, like, why is that? Why should successful attempts be punished more severely than unsuccessful ones? All right. I want to look at another example, and to do this I'm going to sort of employ a little clip from Crash Course Philosophy, a sort of PBS video series.
Here's a scene. A and B are next-door neighbors. They both go to the same party and they both get equally drunk. Then A and B each get in their identical vehicles and drive home, A leaving just minutes before B. As A drunkenly wends their way back home, the roads are deserted and they make it back without incident. But as B drives down the same road just a few minutes later, a child darts out into the road. B's reaction time is impaired by the alcohol and they are unable to stop or swerve in time to avoid striking and killing the child. So who deserves more blame?
All right. Now that video gives us a nice sort of starting point for an example. I'm going to modify it a little bit from the example that Hank Green gave there. We'll call the example drunk drivers, right? We've got two neighbors, you know, sort of keeping fixed, right, where they live, kind of. But they leave the bar drunk. One drives home at 11:07. He swerves all over the place on the way home, but he doesn't hit or kill anyone because there weren't any pedestrians walking along the road. If there had been pedestrians, however, this person would have accidentally hit them, right? So not intentionally hit a pedestrian, but would have hit a pedestrian had there been one walking sort of alongside the road here. Now let's take the other neighbor, right? This neighbor drives home at 11:13, 6 minutes later. This one swerves all over the place just like the first, but this time there is a pedestrian walking alongside the road and the driver hits the pedestrian. Now the question we want to ask is whether the drunk driver should be punished equally, or should the second drunk driver who killed the pedestrian be punished more severely than the first? Now again, I think if we think about what would actually happen in the world as it is, we would see pretty quickly, right, that the drunk driver who killed the pedestrian would be punished more severely than the first. You know, all else being equal, right? Let's assume they don't have, they haven't been in trouble for drunk driving in the past and that sort of thing. So that's what would be the case, right? But I'm asking you this question about what should be the case. Should the drunk drivers be punished equally, or should the second one be punished more severely than the first? That's the question at issue here. Now, I don't know what you think, but if we're going to try and like justify the way the law actually is, we can look to the law of culpable risk creation. According to this, again, this isn't a real law, right? It's just a principle. According to this principle, the law of culpable risk creation should be punished more severely when it causes harm. This is really just like the law of attempts. The difference is that in an attempt, you're trying to cause harm. In the case of culpable risk creation, you're not actually trying to cause any harm, but you're just increasing the risk that others face. So note here, right, I think this is kind of an interesting connection between this issue that we've all been thinking about recently, this like issue about masks. So when you fail to wear a mask out in public, you might not have COVID-19. You might not be a carrier for the virus. You probably aren't, in fact. But when you don't wear a mask, you increase the risk of other people catching it around you. Maybe a small amount, but some amount. And we might ask, is that risk creation justified or not? But anyway, let's sort of set that case to the side. Looking at the drunk driver's example, if the law of culpable risk creation is true, if that's premise 1, culpable risk creation should be punished more severely when it causes harm. Premise 2 says the first drunk driver didn't cause harm, the second drunk driver did cause harm, and both drivers, should be noted, right, were culpably creating risk. Let's assume, right, that they should have realized that they were drunk. They could have easily known. Maybe somebody told them, like, hey, you're drunk, you shouldn't drive home, as they were leaving the bar, that sort of thing. And if those 3 premises are true, then it follows that the second drunk driver should be punished more severely than the first. Again, this first premise, that culpable risk creation should be punished more severely when it causes harm, that's the thing that Kadish is going to question. He's going to be skeptical of. All right, the final sort of doctrine that Kadish sort of has in mind as a version of the harm doctrine, right? So I think if I didn't mention before, it's important to note, like, each of these, the law of attempts, the law of culpable risk creation, the impossibility doctrine, these are all instances of the harm doctrine in the law. Okay, so the impossibility doctrine says an attempt or a case of culpable risk creation should not be punished if it was impossible for that attempt, for that case of culpable risk creation, to cause harm. You might say, what do you have in mind? Like, what's the idea? Kadish gives us some examples. So one example he gives is a case where you lie to someone. So say you try and trick them by lying to them, but they see right through it. They see, like, obviously this person's lying. Like, what's going on? Anybody would notice this. In that case, it was impossible for the lie to succeed, for the lie to sort of get this person to do the thing you wanted them to do, for you to cheat them in the relevant way. And so the law is going to say, like, you can't be guilty of this thing because it was just never going to work, right? You weren't going to be defrauding them or whatever because they weren't fooled by it. So I'm not an expert here. It seems like in some of these cases, like, you can attempt to do things and that will get you in trouble, even if it doesn't actually work out. But we're going to sort of take it on Kadish's word that there are cases that have this kind of structure, this kind of feature, where if people just sort of see through the thing you're trying to do, they're not going to be able to. You're not going to get in trouble for it. Another example he gives is this example of creating, like, this sort of decoy target. Say you've got a deer that the game warden has sort of set up to, I don't know if he's trying to get people to fire it out of season or something, or maybe he's trying to attract other deer. I forget the details of that particular example, but the idea is he set up a decoy, you shoot the deer, it's a fake, but it's not deer season, and so you're actually, shooting at a deer out of season, which would be illegal, but it's a fake deer, so you didn't take a deer out of season. You're probably going to be able to just say in that case, like, well, look, the deer was fake. I wasn't really shooting at an actual deer. And in that case, you're not going to get in trouble because you couldn't have caused harm, right? It was a fake deer. You weren't going to hurt it. So those are some examples of the impossibility doctrine that Kadish gives. All right, we're not going to focus too much on the impossibility doctrine. I think that just adds in some complexities that aren't that aren't all that important for our purposes. The idea, these are all examples of the harm doctrine, and Kadish is going to be critical of that. So one thing that I want to do right before we go any further is just kind of give you a visualization to see what's going on here. So let's start with the snipers kind of case. So what's going on in the snipers case is we've got this sort of diagram I've set up, and we start sort of over on the left here, and time moves from the left to the right. And so the thought is that, like, to start in when we get any sort of crime, we start with someone like forming this sort of intention, and then they do the action that's going to get them in trouble, and then there's some consequence. If one thing is true, then maybe we get consequence 1. If that thing's not the case, then maybe we get consequence 2. So, for example, in the sniper's case, both snipers want to kill Meadows. The action that they do is they take the shot, they fire at her, and then it's important to note that this is an attempt rather than a case of culpable risk creation. So I'm drawing the distinction there between snipers and the drunk driving case. So they attempt to cause some harm. In the first case, right, there's this wind gust, and as a result, the sniper misses Meadows. But in the second case, there's no wind gust, and so the sniper hits Meadows and kills her, right? So what we see is that the intention of these people are the same. The action that they do is the same. What happens is that, like, luck comes into play, criminal law, and the luck of the draw, right? Luck comes into play here, and it results in different sorts of consequences. Now, what Kadish thinks, what I'm pretty sympathetic to, is that, you know, this is really beyond the agent's control. They didn't know a wind gust was coming or not coming. They couldn't have predicted it, let's say. So these agents are the same with respect to their intentions and actions. It seems like they should be punished the same, but as it turns out, we're going to punish the one more than the other. In particular, we're going to punish the second one, right, who ends up hitting Meadows more than the first. But that seems like it's unjustified. Okay, now the second case is the case of the drunk drivers. Both drunk drivers, let's say they have the intention to go home or drive home. The action they do is that they drive after they've been drinking, they drive drunk. This is a case of culpable risk creation, right? Not an attempt to harm anyone, but just they're doing something risky. In the first case, we don't have any pedestrians around on the streets, so they get home safely. In the second case, there is a pedestrian, and so they hit the pedestrian, right? And let's say they kill the pedestrian. Again, in this case, the intentions are the same, the actions are the same. The only difference is sort of the consequences they bring about. Why are those consequences different? Well, because luck intervened sort of this time, somewhere between the action and the end result, and that had, you know, resulted in them having different consequences. I think this diagram, this sort of way of thinking about it, can just be helpful for seeing how luck can influence actions. And as we go forward, we're going to look at some diagrams that are a little bit more complicated than this one, but just show that, like, luck can enter in a variety of different places. So luck can enter here, as it does in this scenario, but luck can also enter here. Somebody might form the intention to do something and then never be able to actually act on it because the situation just doesn't work out right. So imagine the snipers, right? Before they get to take the shot, right, the police apprehend them and capture them. Well, then there's no shot, but there was still the intention. Sometimes we can even get, you know, people who would have formed intentions to do something, except for the fact that something intervened beforehand. We'll look at those cases later. But anyway, the point is that luck can jump in a number of places, but especially when it jumps in here, it seems to Kadish, and I am sympathetic to this, that, like, how could that really make a difference to how much we should punish the person? Okay, so what Kadish argues is there's no good way to justify the doctrines that we've looked at, and the reason for this is that there are no good utilitarian justifications and there are no good retributivist justifications. If there are no good utilitarian justifications and no good retributivist justifications, and that basically like explores or that like exhausts the possibilities, then there's just no good justification at all. So to sort of evaluate that claim, let's look at the different kind of justifications. So in any sort of like broadly utilitarian justifications, one justification for punishment is denunciation. Could this justify something like punishing successful attempts more than unsuccessful ones? Kadish thinks the answer to that is no. Why? Well, he wants to say, we all know that causing harm is worse than not causing harm. So if, giving someone a harsher penalty is saying in a stronger way, like, this is bad, don't do it, we all know that causing harm is worse than not causing harm. So what could it possibly be teaching us or telling us that sort of equal punishment wouldn't be telling us? So the thought here, just to restate it, is that like everybody knows that causing harm is bad and it's worse than not causing harm. So we don't really need to denounce the causing of harm more than not causing harm. The second, we're going to look at deterrence. Right, this is a very central utilitarian kind of justification. The reason we punish people is to discourage them from doing a certain kind of act. So, maybe we want to discourage success more than failure. Sounds right. Sounds plausible. In response, Kadish says, when we punish people who cause harm more severely than people who don't cause harm, that won't do anything to deter attempts. And if it does anything to deter culpable risk creation, it's minimal. So hang in there for a second. Let me try and explain or unpack this. So when someone is attempting a crime, they're not expecting that they might fail. So whether they succeed or don't succeed, right, they're expecting to succeed. And so giving someone a lesser punishment for failing isn't, it's not incentivizing people to fail, right? Because just insofar as they attempted the crime, they're trying to get it right. Like they're trying to be successful. So when we punish unsuccessful attempts less than the successful ones, we're just sort of like giving people a break, like giving them a benefit that maybe we don't think they really like deserve in any sense. If they were trying to kill the person, that's not okay. And giving them a sort of a less severe sentence doesn't do anything to like make them fail at a greater risk. It seems like maybe giving a sort of a lesser sentence to people who culpably create risk. Maybe there's a way in which having a difference between the two penalties discourages it. So in particular, it's not like punishing the people who fail less, but it's rather punishing the people who actually cause harm more. So if you're driving drunk and like, oh man, not only could I like get in trouble for driving drunk, but if I accidentally kill someone, actually cause a lot of harm, then I'm going to get this stiffer penalty. That might actually discourage drunk driving a bit. But like how much it does that is probably kind of minimal, right? People usually don't go into culpably creating risk in cases where they're thinking like, oh, I could really hurt someone. Usually they do it thinking like, no, I'm not going to harm anyone. So Kadish thinks like that's not, if that's the reason why we have this difference, it's not a very compelling one. Maybe it works potentially for the culpable risk creation types of cases, but it's not going to work for the attempts kinds of cases. All right, incapacitation. One thing you might think is like, well, we punish people who cause harm more than people who don't because we like need to lock them up more. But Kadish is kind of skeptical of this. Like criminals who cause harm, he doesn't think are any more dangerous than those who don't cause harm. So think of the snipers, right? It's not like the first sniper, because the wind blew, is less dangerous than the one who was successful. It's like, no, that's irrelevant. Both of these snipers are equally dangerous. Now, you might think insofar as someone is successful, maybe there's some evidence to think that they are slightly more dangerous, like they're slightly more competent because they actually achieve the goals that they're trying to bring about. Again, though, that's sort of like a very minor point, and in many cases doesn't hold, right? As we were showing, right, that in many of these cases, just luck that differentiates the successful ones from the unsuccessful ones. So there's not like some, it's not like there are these sort of people who are going around botching botching murders all over the place, and they're not really that dangerous. Who you really got to watch out for, the good murderers. That's not really a problem that would sort of justify this policy. Finally, when we think about reformation, that might be another utilitarian justification for punishment. And so maybe you think like people who cause harm need more reformation than people who don't. But again, I think that's just kind of bizarre. Right? Criminals who don't cause harm. Criminals who cause harm don't need any more reformation than those criminals who don't. So, whether you cause harm or not, you're an equally bad person. In virtue of the fact that you tried to cause harm, and so there's no additional reformation that successful criminals need. All right, that exhausts the sort of potential utilitarian justifications, and I've sort of given Kadish's responses to those potential justifications. Again, this section is hard. Like, I think one thing I should say here is like this paper is deep and maybe tricky to follow in a way that some of the other papers we have read are not. But I think there's something valuable to sort of exploring these ideas and reading it carefully and slowly. I think it's worth it, right? So I realize it's kind of tricky, but you do want to be able to kind of explain these things on the exam or to your family and friends at home, or whatever the case is. I do want to see that you can explain it. All right, retributivist justifications for the harm doctrine. I'm going to focus here on two that are kind of sophisticated. So generally speaking, you might think, what do people deserve? And what they deserve might depend, or at least, for our purposes, it's pretty plausible that it depends on their intentions and their actions. What they intend to do, what they actually do. I think maybe intentions is like the most obvious thing to think it depends on. But even if you think no, it just depends on their actions, well, we've already stipulated in all these cases the intentions and the actions are the same. There's no difference. The only difference comes after the fact and the consequences. And so it just seems like they would deserve the same thing. But maybe, there are some like retributivist schemes that would justify a policy like this. Like there's nothing unfair about giving these people a different penalty. One of those justifications would be a kind of penal lottery. So the thought here is like, okay, there are a bunch of people who have these bad intentions, and they try to do this really bad thing, but we don't want to punish them all like real severely. We want to like hold out the threat of the severe penalty, but we want to like let some of them off a little bit less severely. And so what we'll do is we're really just sort of essentially punishing some people that do this crime. We're punishing some of them a lot, and punishing others a little bit. And how do we figure out who's who? Well, we'll just see how much harm people cause, and the people who end up causing more harm will get the stiffer penalties, and the people who cause less harm will get lesser penalties. Alternatively, we could do it by like rolling a die, but you might think, oh, that's like kind of bizarre. but maybe equally acceptable. I don't know. But instead of rolling a die, we're just gonna use the harm they cause as the determiner of whether or not they're going to get a stiff sentence or a light sentence. So that's how the penal lottery idea works. What Kadish says here is that penal lotteries aren't justifiable because the results of these lotteries are arbitrary. So the idea here is like, if you're a retributivist, then you think, you should get what you deserve. But a lottery system doesn't give you what you deserve, it just gives you some sort of like random outcome. And there's a way in which it's fair, right? Everyone's treated the same. Everyone has to play the lottery, but the results are arbitrary. So for Kadish, the idea is that penal lotteries, generally speaking, are problematic in that they leave punishment up to some sort of arbitrary fact, whether that's the harm you cause or the roll of the dice or whatever it is. There's a way in which people aren't getting the same punishment for the same behavior. But even if penal lotteries were justifiable, Kadish says, it seems like there might be fairer ways to run them. So like how much harm you cause isn't like the fairest way to determine what punishment we're going to give you. If we could have a penal lottery system, and if that were justifiable, we should maybe do it in a different way. That's his thought. The other retributivist justification that you might kind of get for the harm doctrine is one on which, or like a sort of a theory of punishment or approach to punishment on which punishment is like a kind of license. So, James Bond, right? License to kill, right? There's the licenses to kill. Maybe there are licenses to attempt to kill. And, what kind of license do you want? Do you want a license to kill, or do you want a license to attempt to kill someone? You say, like, I want a license to kill. And then the thought is, well, like, how much are we going to charge you for that? How much are we going to charge you for a license to kill as opposed to a license to just attempt to kill, or a license to wound, or something like that? And the thought is, a license to actually do it is going to be more costly. Society doesn't want you killing people. So if you want to kill someone, you got to pay a lot. And so how it would work is like someone who is successful in causing harm has to pay more, and that payment is in terms of like years in prison, something like that. Someone who has a license to wound or a license to merely attempt to kill, right? That license is less expensive. It's a little bit cheaper, so you're not going to get as much time in prison. So what Kadish says here is that there are some crimes like tax evasion that do give perpetrators a benefit, but he thinks that's the exceptional case, right? Rather than the normal case. It's the exception rather than the rule. So ordinarily, we don't think of people who commit crimes as like securing some benefit that they would need a license for. Tax evasion, right? Say you want to evade your taxes. You don't want to have to pay your taxes. Okay, we're going to throw you in prison. Evading your taxes is some benefit. Maybe we make you pay by making you go to prison. But ordinarily, like, committing a crime isn't giving you some significant benefit that like people would really want to pay for. So he gives examples of like abducting a child or viciously assaulting a stranger. Like, no one thinks like, oh man, I would really pay money to have the chance to abduct a child or a chance to assault a random stranger. No, so we don't think that those people are like really getting any like leg up on us that they would need to pay for. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what to say here, because thinking about punishment as a licensing scheme is just kind of a bizarre way to think about punishment in the first place. But if you were to sort of think about it that way, and we can see why, like, somebody might think, oh, I really wish I could like steal in this case. And so, so maybe I can see why if I actually succeed, then my punishment should be greater because the license for succeeding is going to be more costly to society than the license to merely attempt. You can sort of see that, but it's only going to work for some punishments. For some crimes. It's not going to really work for other crimes. And so maybe something like the harm doctrine is justified in the case of some crimes, but for the majority of crimes, it's not really going to make any sense. All right. So Kadish has been through the utilitarian justifications, he's been through the attributivist justifications, and he thinks none of them ultimately really work. None of them explain why we have these doctrines. So here's the argument. If there are no good utilitarian or attributive justifications for the harm doctrine, then that doctrine isn't rationally defensible. Premise 2 says there are no good utilitarian or attributive justifications for the harm doctrine. That's what he's just tried to show us. And the conclusion is that therefore the harm doctrine isn't rationally defensible. So that's a valid argument. Is it sound? Do you accept premise 2? Do you think he's given us convincing reasons to think that none of these utilitarian or attributivist justifications for the harm doctrine works? Maybe you do accept that. Then the question would be, well, should we revisit premise 1, right? Maybe there's some other sort of theory out there that could justify the harm doctrine and make it rationally defensible. In closing, right, I want to look at one last example and just sort of run through the thinking again one more time, and maybe prompt you and encourage you to apply what we've learned. So let's go back to the Billy Budd case, right? Assume that Billy Budd and Claggart aren't in the Navy, they're not on a battleship, they're not in a war, they're just two guys, right? And they get into a bar fight. Maybe they haven't been drinking, right? They're the designated drivers or something like that. Right? Let's make this as simple as possible. They're just two guys, they get angry at each other, they get into a fight. In the first scenario, Billy punches Claggart and gives him a black eye. I'm going to call him Billy B because he is going to be later charged with battery for punching and injuring Claggart. In the second scenario, Billy IM punches Claggart and kills him. So I'm going to call him Billy IM because he's going to be convicted of involuntary manslaughter because he, not intentionally, right, but involuntarily, but he does kill Claggart, so that'd be involuntary manslaughter. Should these two people be punished equally, or should Billy IM, who caused more harm, be punished more severely than Billy B? Again, now I'm having gone through Kadish's argument, and I'm asking you another question that's just really getting to your intuitions. Do you think the harm doctrine is justifiable or not? One thing you might think about doing, or as practice, right? Just draw that diagram that I gave you before. What's their intention? What's the action? What's consequence 1? Billy B ends up, in the one consequence. What's, Billy IM ends up in the other consequence. What's the difference, or how did luck play in? What happened that resulted in Billy IM killing Claggart and Billy B not? I haven't actually included that part of the story, right? So, what happens? Claggart trips and falls and hits his head on something that's on the ground or something like that. So just being able to know how that diagram works. Now, we want to think about what could justify the law in punching Billy IM more severely than Billy B. One thought is that if we don't, then we won't adequately deter people from getting into bar fights, right? So if everybody just gets punished, like Billy B gets punished for punching Claggart, then people don't really have, they have a disincentive to get in a bar fight, but they sort of could potentially like get away with murdering someone if they like get in a bar fight and start really trying to like wail on someone. So uh, the thought is that possibility that the person you're fighting with could die. We maybe want to deter you from going at it too strongly or something. This would be a kind of utilitarian justification, right? The goal is deterrence, and we think, having the possibility that's a really high penalty deters from the fight. Now, the problem with this justification is that we could probably get the same result and do it more justly by punishing everyone who gets into a bar fight equally, provided that we punish them more severely than we typically punish people for battery, though less severely than we typically punish people for involuntary manslaughter. So the thought is, whatever the punishment is for battery, maybe it's not serious enough, given that punching someone could ultimately result in their death. And so what we want to do is like make the punishment for this sort of like minor thing that has the risk of causing like a lot of harm, we should make that penalty like pretty high, though not so high that every time you punch someone you're like put on death row or something like that. But we can disincentivize it in a better, fairer way, not by having this sort of like a lottery where if you kill someone, turns out you got to go to prison for a really long time, but rather just saying, no, you get a pretty stiff penalty no matter what happens. Some people, right, are going to end up killing someone in a bar fight, and that's, it's really unfortunate and sad, and we don't want that, but we're not going to put someone in jail, for a really, really long time just because they got in a bar fight and they got sort of bad luck. Conversely, if nothing really bad happens, we're not going to like let that person off the hook. Like they were in a bar fight and that was serious, and they deserve this really serious penalty. That's the thinking. So the question then that we're left with is like, why does our criminal justice system employ the harm doctrine at all? If there isn't a utilitarian justification and there isn't a retributivist justification, like what kind of justification can we give? What's going on here? In a way, like this should be like a really troubling feature of our criminal justice system. Say like, what are we doing? This thing is either like it's useless and it's unjust. That's a bad combination. Let me just give you a story that maybe explains why we do what we do. I don't know that there's a justification. It's just sort of a potential explanation for why we do it the way that we do. So imagine that we've got these, the two people, Billy and Claggart, and like what I've tried to draw on a scale is like their well-being, like how well off they are in life. And I've said that like Billy is like a bit better off than Claggart, and that's just because like Claggart's kind of a mean, evil guy. I don't know if evil guys are always worse off than like good people. Sometimes like evil people are better off than good people, but I get the impression Claggart's not like having a great life. Bad people, I think they have not their like lives are harder psychologically. They're not really satisfied with how things are going. Anyway, I've just put him a little bit less, but if you want to think of him in sort of a different position, that's fine too. The thought is like, this is how their lives are going, and then afterwards there's some impact that the punch or the fight, right, has on Billy and Claggart. So I want to represent that by like Claggart, sort of his life well-being like goes down when he's just gets the black eye or gets punched in the face. That's bad. And so one thing we might think is like, well, Billy did that. Like Billy's responsible for lowering Claggart's well-being there, and we might think like all else being equal, if we assume like up to this point Billy and Claggart are like morally equal, well, Billy's caused Claggart to be down there, and we don't really think that a bad person who causes someone else to suffer should be able to, like, you know, be better off than that person who they caused to suffer. So the thought is maybe we have to lower Billy down to Claggart's level. And so, but if he only like gives him a black eye, we don't have to lower it all that much. We can just lower it a little bit. But now if we think of the involuntary manslaughter case, right? So again, we have Billy and Claggart at a certain level of well-being, but after this fight, after the punch, right, Claggart is killed, so his well-being goes down to 0. And the thought might be, well, even if Billy didn't really intend it, even if it was accidental, right, Billy's responsible for it. And, Billy essentially killed Claggart. Right? He doesn't deserve to be any better off. To lower him just a little bit would not be the sort of right approach. I think in a way this kind of goes back to some of the things we talked about earlier when like you can't benefit from your own crime or something like that. You can't kill someone and just get some like minor harm from it. So that's why maybe we want to, in the case in Billy Budd, right? Billy's executed. We think, well, his like well-being should be zeroed out as well, so he's not better off than the person who he harmed. I think that might be sort of what's going on. Whether or not the criminal justice system is the right system for this is unclear. So maybe I think it might be right to say that, well, Billy really owes compensation to Claggart. Maybe he can't give it to Claggart, but he could pay Claggart's family or something. Maybe he owes them a lot because of the sort of harm that he's done. But, is taking his life for the fact that he sort of had this punch that unluckily killed Claggart, is that really appropriate? Seems like maybe that's too severe. So, what is this like sort of thinking? Is it utilitarian or retributivist? I don't know that I have a great answer for that. Maybe there's something about like the restorative view. This really isn't restorative justice, but something like, there's a kind of balancing of the scales. We're thinking in terms of desert, but not in sort of the typical way we think of desert, but as far as like you've got some debt to pay, and if we mistakenly think like more prison is like paying a debt, maybe that kind of makes sense. Anyway, I'm sorry this video has gone really long. Hope you've hung in there. I think this paper is really interesting. Maybe I should just say as an aside, like I wrote sort of a master's thesis on this stuff about luck, and so I think it's really fascinating. But anyway, the question I want to leave you with is this question: why does our criminal justice system employ the harm doctrine? And then, if we can come up with some explanation for why it's doing that, we can then ask this question: well, is it justified in doing that? So, if there's no good explanation, well, that's bad. But even if we get some explanation, we can ask, is that explanation a good one? Is it a justification? And if it's not, then maybe we should switch the policy. So that's it for this video. Thanks again for hanging in there, and we'll see you later.